Hello, welcome back. This is Miss Williams and Lobo reading the next few chapters of Flora and Ulysses by Kate DiCamillo. We are reading this with the permission of Candlewick Press. Thank you very much, Candlewick Press. When we left off, Flora had saved Ulysses from the vacuum cleaner, and then he seemed to have some kind of crazy magical power. He lifted the entire vacuum cleaner up and shook the crackers out of it and ate some crackers. And then Flora called him and said to come, and he listened and came to her. So she's amazed by this little squirrel who's so cute. And she's going to call him Ulysses. Another important thing to remember about Flora is that she loves reading comic books, especially The Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto. And she also likes that section of the comic book called Terrible Things Could Happen to You. And that continues to be important throughout the story. All right, chapter 10 is called Squirrel Smuggling. Flora's mother was in the kitchen. She was typing. She wrote on an old typewriter, and when she pounded the keys, the kitchen table shook, and the plates on the shelves rattled, and the silverware in the drawers cried out in a metallic kind of alarm. Flora had decided that this was part of the reason her parents had divorced. Not the noise of the writing, but the writing itself, specifically the writing of romance. Flora's father had said, "I think that your mother is so in love with her books about love that she doesn't love me anymore." And her mother had said, "Ha! Your father is so far off in left field that he wouldn't recognize love if it stood up in his soup and sang." Flora had had a hard time imagining what love would be doing, standing up in a bowl of soup and singing, but these were the kind of idiotic words her parents spoke, and they said the words to each other, even though they were pretending that they were talking to Flora. It was all very annoying. "What are you doing?" her mother said to Flora. She was sucking on a Pitzer Pop. It made her words sound rocky and sharp-edged. Her mother used to smoke, and then she stopped, but she still had to have something in her mouth when she typed, so she consumed a lot of Pitzer Pops. This one was orange flavored. Flora could smell it. "Oh, nothing," said Flora. She glanced at the squirrel in her arms. "Good," said her mother. She whacked the carriage return on the typewriter. Without looking up, she kept typing. "Are you still standing there?" her mother said. She typed some more words. She hit the carriage return again. "I'm on a deadline here. It's hard to concentrate with you standing over me breathing like that." "I could stop breathing," said Flora. "Oh, don't be ridiculous," said her mother. "Go upstairs and wash your hands. We're going to eat soon." "Okay," said Flora. She walked past her mother and into the living room, still carrying Ulysses in the crook of her arm. It didn't seem possible, but it was true. She had smuggled a squirrel into the house, and she had done it right under her mother's nose, or behind her back, or something. In the living room, at the base of the stairs, the little shepherdess lamp was waiting. A pink-cheeked smirk plastered on her face. Flora hated the little shepherdess. Her mother had bought the lamp with her first royalty check from her book, On Feathered Wings of Joy, which was the stupidest title for a book that Flora had ever heard in her life. So here is an illustration. You can see Flora's mother on the typewriter, Flora standing behind her with Ulysses, and then way over here you can see this lamp that she's talking about, the little shepherdess lamp. Okay. Her mother had sent away to London for the lamp. When it arrived, she unpacked it and plugged it in, and then clapped her hands and said, "Oh, she's so beautiful. Isn't she beautiful? I love her with all my heart." Flora's mother never called Flora beautiful. She never said that she loved her with all her heart. Luckily, Flora was a cynic and didn't care whether her mother loved her or not. I think that I will call her Marianne, her mother had said. Marianne, said Flora. You're going to name a lamp? Marianne, shepherdess to the lost, said her mother. Who's lost exactly, said Flora. But her mother hadn't bothered to answer that question. This, Flora said to the squirrel, is the little shepherdess. Her name is Marianne. Unfortunately, she lives here too. The squirrel considered Marianne. Flora narrowed her eyes and stared at the lamp. She knew that it was ridiculous, but sometimes she felt as if Marianne knew something that she didn't know, that the little shepherdess was keeping some dark and terrible secret. You stupid lamp, said Flora. Mind your own business. Mind your sheep. Actually, there was just one sheep, a tiny lamb curled up at Marianne's pink slippered feet. Flora always wanted to say to the little shepherdess, if you're such a great shepherdess, where are the rest of your sheep, huh? We can just ignore her, said Flora to Ulysses. She turned away from the smug and glowing Marianne and climbed the stairs to her room, holding Ulysses gently, carefully in her arms. He didn't glow, but he was surprisingly warm for someone so small. Okay. I don't think that Flora really doesn't care if her mother loves her. I think it has something to do with her calling herself a cynic. Anyway, just something to think about. Chapter 11, a gigantic vat of incandesto. She put Ulysses down on her bed, and he looked even smaller sitting there in the bright overhead light. He also looked pretty bald. Good grief, said Flora. The squirrel certainly didn't look very heroic, but then neither did the nearsighted, unassuming janitor Alfred T. Slipper. Ulysses looked up at Flora, and then he looked down at his tail. He seemed relieved to see it. He lowered his nose and sniffed along the length of it. I'm hoping that you can understand me, said Flora. The squirrel raised his head. He stared at her. Wow, said Flora. Great. Okay. I can't understand you, and that's a small problem, but we'll figure out a way to communicate, okay? Nod at me if you understand what I'm saying, like this. Flora nodded. And Ulysses nodded back. Flora's heart leapt up high in her chest. I'm going to try and explain what happened to you, okay? Ulysses nodded his head very fast. And again, Flora's heart leapt up high inside of her in a hopeful and extremely uncynical kind of way. She closed her eyes. Don't hope, she told her heart. Do not hope. Instead, observe. Do not hope, instead observe, was a piece of advice that appeared often in Terrible Things Can Happen to You. According to Terrible Things, hope sometimes got in the way of action. For instance, if you looked at your elderly Aunt Edith choking on a piece of steak from the all-you-can-eat buffet and you told yourself, man, I sure hope she's not choking, you would waste several valuable life-saving Heimlich maneuver performing seconds. Do not hope, instead observe, were words that Flora, as a cynic, had found useful in the extreme. She repeated them to herself a lot. Okay, said Flora. She opened her eyes. She looked at the squirrel. What happened is that you got vacuumed. And because you got vacuumed, you might have, powers. Ulysses gave her a questioning look. Do you know what a superhero is? The squirrel continued to stare at her. Right, said Flora. Of course you don't. A superhero is someone with special powers, and he uses those powers to fight the forces of darkness and evil, like Alfred T. Slipper, who is also incandesto. Ulysses blinked several times in a nervous kind of way. Look, she's showing him the comics. Look, said Flora. She grabbed the illuminated adventures of the amazing Incandesto off her desk. She pointed at Alfred in his janitor uniform. See, she said, this is Alfred, and he is an unassuming, nearsighted, stuttering janitor who works cleaning the multi-floor offices of the Paxtocket Life Insurance Company. He lives a quiet life in his studio apartment with only his parakeet, Dolores, for company. Ulysses looked down at the picture of Alfred and then up at Flora. Okay, said Flora. So one day, Alfred takes a tour of the Incandesto cleaning solution factory, and he slips, Alfred T. Slipper, get it? Into a gigantic vat of Incandesto, and it changes him. And so now, when there is a great crisis, when malfeasance is apparent, Alfred turns himself into... Flora flipped through the pages of the comic and stopped at the panel that showed the glowing, powerful Incandesto. Incandesto, she said. See? Alfred T. Slipper becomes a righteous pillar of light so painfully bright that the most heinous villain trembles before him and confesses. Flora realized that she was shouting the tiniest bit. She looked down at Ulysses. His eyes were enormous in his small face. Flora tried to sound calm, reasonable. She lowered her voice. As Incandesto, she said, Alfred sheds light into the darkest corners of the universe. He can fly. Also, he visits the elderly. And that's what a superhero is. And I think you might be one too. At least, I think you have powers. So far, all we know is that you're really strong. Ulysses nodded. He puffed out his chest. Flora, her mother shouted. Get down here, dinner is ready. But what else can you do? Said Flora to the squirrel. And if you truly are a superhero, how will you fight evil? Ulysses furrowed his brow. Flora bent down. She put her face close to his. Think about it, she said. Imagine what we might be able to do. Florabelle, her mother shouted. I can hear you up there talking to yourself. You shouldn't talk to yourself. People will hear you and think that you're strange. I'm not talking to myself, Flora shouted. Well then, with whom are you speaking? A squirrel? There was a long silence from down below, and then her mother shouted, That's not funny, Florabelle. Get down here right now. Chapter 12. The Forces of Evil. When Flora came back upstairs after dinner, she found Ulysses curled up in a tight little ball, sleeping on her pillow. She put out her hand and touched his forehead with one finger. His eyes twitched, but they didn't open. She picked up the pillow and moved it carefully to the foot of the bed. She changed into her pajamas, lay down, and imagined the words, a superhero squirrel rested at her feet, and so she was not lonely at all, emblazoned on the ceiling above her. That's exactly right, she said. Before the divorce, before her father had moved out of the house and into an apartment, he had often sat beside her at night and read aloud to her from The Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto. It was his favorite comic. It always cheered him up to read about Alfred T. Slipper and Dolores. Her father did an excellent parakeet imitation. Holy Bagumba, he would say in the voice of Dolores. Holy unanticipated occurrences. Holy unanticipated occurrences was what Dolores would say when something truly unexpected and unbelievable was happening, which was basically all the time. Life was pretty exciting when you were Incandesto's parakeet. Flora sat up and looked down at the sleeping squirrel. Holy unanticipated occurrences, she said. It sounded better when her father said it. Not that he said it these days. He didn't say much of anything anymore. Her father had always been a sad, quiet man, But since the divorce, he had become even sadder and quieter, which was fine with Flora. Really, cynics don't like a lot of chatter. Besides, Alfred T. Slipper was a quiet man, too. For instance, when he was on his tour of the Incandesto manufacturing facility and had fallen into the vat of Incandesto, he hadn't said a single word, not even oops. Words had appeared above his head, however, and Flora's father had read those words to her so many times that she could recite them by heart. He is an unassuming janitor, but he will dare to battle the darkness of the universe. Do you doubt him? Do not. Alfred T. Slipper will live to fight the forces of evil. He will become known to the world as Incandesto. Flora lay back down. If the squirrel were in a comic, she thought, what words would have appeared in the space over his head when he was sucked into the vacuum cleaner? He is an unassuming squirrel. Yep. But he will soon conquer villains of all stripes. He will defend the defenseless and protect the weak. That sounded good, too. He will become known to the world as Ulysses. Holy Bagumba! Anything could happen. Together, she and Ulysses could change the world, or something. Do not hope, instead observe, Flora whispered to calm herself down. Just observe the squirrel. And then she fell asleep. Okay. Thank you for listening. I'll read some more tomorrow. Bye.